Betrayal is one of the most painful experiences a person can go through. It shakes the very foundation of trust and can leave deep emotional wounds that take time to heal. When someone we love and trust turns against us, it can feel like our whole world is falling apart. The pain of betrayal is not just in the act itself, but in the realization that someone we believed in, someone we depended on, has broken that trust. Betrayal can come in many forms. It can happen in friendships, in families, in marriages, in workplaces, and even within the church. A friend you confided in may spread lies about you. A family member may turn their back on you in your time of need. A spouse may break the sacred vows of marriage. A co-worker may deceive you for their own gain. No matter how it happens, betrayal brings heartache, disappointment, and sometimes even a sense of isolation. However, betrayal is not a new experience. It has been happening since the beginning of time. The Bible is filled with stories of men and women who suffered betrayal but overcame it through God's strength. Joseph was betrayed by his own brothers, thrown into a pit and sold into slavery. Imagine the pain he must have felt, knowing that the very people who were supposed to protect him were the ones who abandoned him. David was betrayed by King Saul, a man he had faithfully served. He was hunted like a criminal, forced to flee for his life despite his loyalty. Jesus, the Son of God, was betrayed by Judas, one of his own disciples, for 30 pieces of silver. He was handed over to his enemies and crucified, even though he had done nothing wrong. These stories remind us that betrayal is part of the human experience. If even the most faithful servants of God have endured it, we should not be surprised when it happens to us. But that does not make it any less painful. The natural response to betrayal is anger, hurt, and sometimes even a desire for revenge. The wound left by betrayal can be so deep that it affects our ability to trust others in the future. It can make us feel like we are alone, like no one truly understands our pain. Yet, in the midst of betrayal, there is hope. God sees every injustice. He knows every tear you have cried, every sleepless night you have endured. He understands the depth of your pain because he has walked that road himself. Jesus was betrayed, abandoned, and denied by those closest to him. Yet he responded not with hatred, but with love and forgiveness. This is the example we are called to follow. When betrayal comes, we must remember that God is still in control. The people who betray us may think they have won, but God is always working behind the scenes. Joseph's brothers meant to harm him, but God used their betrayal to position Joseph for a greater purpose. What others intend for evil, if you have been betrayed, do not let it define you. Do not allow the pain to turn into bitterness. Instead, bring your hurt to God. He is the only one who can heal the wounds of betrayal and restore what was lost. Trust that he will bring justice in his perfect time. Even when people fail you, God never will. He remains faithful, and his love for you is unchanging. Though betrayal is painful, it is not the end of your story. God has a greater plan for your life, and no act of betrayal can stop his purpose from being fulfilled. The road to healing may not be easy, but with God's strength, you can overcome the hurt and walk in the victory he has prepared for you. When betrayal strikes, it can feel like no one understands the depth of your pain. The heartbreak of being deceived by someone you trusted can leave you feeling abandoned, rejected, and alone. You may wonder if anyone truly sees what you're going through, if anyone cares about the suffering you are experiencing. But in those moments of sorrow and disappointment, you can take comfort in this truth. God sees your pain. Nothing escapes his attention. He is fully aware of every tear you have shed, every sleepless night you have endured, and every wound inflicted upon your heart. When others betray you, walk away from you, or hurt you, God is not distant or indifferent. He is near, watching over you, and his heart is moved by your suffering. The Bible tells us in Psalm 34:18, the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. This means that even when you feel like no one understands, God does. When you feel like no one cares, God does. When it seems like no one sees the injustice you have endured. Betrayal often brings a flood of emotions: anger, sadness, confusion, and even self-doubt. You might ask yourself why this happened, what you did to deserve it, or whether you will ever be able to trust again. But God does not want you to carry that burden alone. He invites you to bring your pain to Him. In Matthew 11:28, Jesus says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." The weight of betrayal is heavy, but when you give it to God, He offers you comfort and healing in return. Throughout Scripture, we see examples of people who were betrayed, yet God saw their pain and worked powerfully in their lives. Joseph was thrown into a pit and sold into slavery by his own brothers. He was falsely accused and imprisoned, suffering for years because of the betrayal of others. Yet through it all, God never abandoned him. God saw his suffering and in time lifted him up to a position of great authority in Egypt. What others meant for harm, God used for good. David, a man after God's own heart, was betrayed by King Saul and later by his own son, Absalom. He spent years running for his life, hiding in caves, feeling the sting of rejection from those who should have supported him. But even in his lowest moments, David knew that God saw his pain. That's why he wrote in Psalm 56:8, "You keep track of all my sorrows. You have collected all my tears in your bottle. You have recorded each one in your book." David understood that even when people failed him, God never did. Perhaps the greatest example of betrayal is Jesus himself. One of his closest disciples, Judas, betrayed him with a kiss, selling him for 30 pieces of silver. Peter, another disciple, denied knowing him 3 times. The very people Jesus came to save turned against him, demanding his crucifixion. Yet through it all, God saw every injustice, every false accusation, and every act of cruelty. And in the end, God's plan was fulfilled. Jesus rose from the grave, victorious over sin and death. If you have been betrayed, remember that God is not blind to your suffering. He sees the pain in your heart, the wounds left by others, and the sorrow that weighs you down. But He does not just see. He cares. He is not a distant observer. He is your loving Father who wants to heal you and restore you. He promises to never leave you nor forsake you. You do not have to walk through this pain alone. When others fail you, God remains faithful. When others turn their backs on you, God draws near. When others hurt you, God offers healing. He sees your pain, and in His perfect time, He will bring justice, restoration, and peace to your heart. Trust in Him, for He is always watching over you with love and compassion. When you face betrayal, it is natural to feel hurt, angry, and even vengeful. The pain of being wronged by someone you trusted can make you want to take matters into your own hands, to seek justice or to make that person feel the way they made you feel. But you don't have to fight this battle on your own. God is your defender, and He will bring justice in His perfect time and way. The Bible makes it clear that God is the ultimate judge. He sees everything, including the wrongs committed against you. In Deuteronomy 32:35, God says, "It is mine to avenge. I will repay." This verse is a reminder that when others betray us, we do not have to seek revenge or try to prove ourselves. God sees it all, and He will handle it far better than we ever could. He knows the truth, and in the right time, He will bring justice. One of the most powerful examples of God's defense in the face of betrayal is the story of Joseph. His own brothers turned against him, threw him into a pit, and sold him into slavery. Later, he was falsely accused and imprisoned for a crime he did not commit. Everything seemed to be against him, yet Joseph never sought revenge. He remained faithful, and in the end, God raised him up to become a ruler in Egypt. When his brothers came before him years later, fearing punishment, Joseph responded with grace and said, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." Instead of fighting back, Joseph trusted God, and God defended him by turning his suffering into a testimony of his power. David's life also shows us what it means to let God be our defender. King Saul, whom David had served faithfully, became jealous and tried to kill him. David had many opportunities to retaliate, but he refused to harm Saul, saying, "May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me, but my hand will not touch you." David understood that justice belongs to God. Because of his faithfulness, God eventually removed Saul and made David king in his perfect timing. Jesus, too, is the ultimate example of trusting God to defend us. When he was betrayed by Judas, falsely accused and sentenced to death, he did not fight back. He did not curse those who hurt him. Instead, he prayed for them, saying, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Even in the face of the greatest betrayal and injustice, Jesus trusted that God's plan would prevail. And it did. His resurrection proved that no betrayal, no injustice, and no evil act can stop God's purpose. If you have been betrayed, know that you do not have to carry the burden of revenge or proving yourself. God sees every injustice, and he promises to fight for you. Psalm 46:1 says, "God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble." When others turn against you, God stands beside you. When you feel alone, he is there. When you are falsely accused or mistreated, he will bring the truth to light. You may not see justice immediately, but trust that God is working behind the scenes. He knows the full story, and he will defend you in ways you never imagined. Instead of allowing bitterness to take root, surrender your pain to him. When you trust him as your defender, you will experience peace beyond understanding, knowing that he is in control. God's justice is perfect, and in his time he will make all things right. Let him be your strength, your shield, and your refuge. Betrayal can feel like the end of the road. When someone you trusted turns against you, it can leave you feeling lost, broken, and unsure of what comes next. The pain of betrayal is not just in the act itself, but in the aftermath, the lingering questions, the shattered trust, and the uncertainty about the future. It can be easy to believe that betrayal has permanently altered your life for the worse, but the truth is that betrayal is not the end of your story. God has a greater plan, and he can use even the deepest wounds to bring about something good. Throughout the Bible, we see powerful examples of people who were betrayed but went on to fulfill their God-given purpose. One of the most well-known stories is that of Joseph. His own brothers, the very people who should have protected him, were jealous of him. They threw him into a pit and sold him into slavery, caring nothing about what would happen to him. Joseph could have given up in despair, believing his life was over. Instead, he remained faithful to God, and despite facing further betrayal and false accusations, God raised him up. He became a ruler in Egypt, second only to Pharaoh, and in the end he was able to save not only his family but an entire nation from famine. When he finally confronted his brothers, he said, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Genesis 50:20, what was meant to destroy him became the very thing that positioned him for greatness. David's story is another powerful reminder that betrayal does not have the final word. David was a loyal servant to King Saul, yet Saul became jealous of him and sought to take his life. David was forced to flee, hiding in caves and running for years to escape Saul's wrath. But even in the midst of betrayal and hardship, God was preparing David for his destiny. In time, David became king of Israel, just as God had planned. If he had allowed betrayal to make him bitter or given up on his calling, he never would have stepped into the role God had for him. Even Jesus himself experienced betrayal. Judas, one of his own disciples, sold him out for 30 pieces of silver. Peter, who had promised to stand by him, denied even knowing him when things became difficult. The very people Jesus came to save turned against him, shouting for his crucifixion. Yet, even in this ultimate betrayal, God's plan was unfolding. The cross was not the end of Jesus' story. 3 days later, he rose in victory. What looked like defeat was actually the greatest triumph in history. If you have been betrayed, it is important to remember that this is not the end of your story either. What was meant to break you can be what strengthens you. What was meant to destroy you can be what positions you for a greater purpose. God is not finished with you. He has a plan, and He can take even the most painful situations and turn them into something beautiful. The key is to trust Him through the process. It is easy to focus on the pain and the injustice, but when you surrender your hurt to God, He will use it for your good. Romans 8:28 reminds us, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. That means no betrayal, no act of injustice, and no painful experience is wasted in God's hand. Instead of allowing betrayal to define you, let it refine you. Let it draw you closer to God, strengthen your faith, and prepare you for the blessings that are ahead. The road may not be easy, but if you keep trusting God, you will see that He has something greater in store. The betrayal you faced is not the final chapter. God is still writing your story, and the best is yet to come. Betrayal can shake the very core of your trust, leaving you feeling broken, abandoned, and unsure of whom to rely on. The pain of being deceived by someone you trusted can be overwhelming, leading to anger, resentment, and even despair. In those moments, it may feel impossible to move forward, and the weight of betrayal can make you question everything, including God's presence in your life. However, even in the midst of pain, there is hope. The key to overcoming betrayal is not allowing it to make you bitter, but rather choosing to trust God through the pain. God never promised that life would be free from hardships, but He did promise that He would be with us through them. In Isaiah 41:10, He says, "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." When betrayal happens, it may feel like you are alone, but God is standing beside you. He sees your tears, He hears your prayers, and He understands your pain. Trusting Him means believing that He is still in control even when things seem to be falling apart. One of the most powerful examples of trusting God through betrayal is found in the life of Jesus. He was betrayed by one of His own disciples, Judas, who handed Him over to his enemies for 30 pieces of silver. Another disciple, Peter, denied even knowing Him when he needed support the most. The very people Jesus came to save turned against Him, calling for His crucifixion. Yet through it all, Jesus remained faithful to His mission. He did not allow bitterness or anger to consume Him. Instead, He entrusted Himself to God, knowing that His suffering had a greater purpose. On the cross, He even prayed for those who betrayed Him, saying, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Luke 23:34. When we face betrayal, we have a choice. We can hold on to the pain and allow it to harden our hearts, or we can surrender it to God and allow Him to heal us. Holding on to anger and resentment only hurts us more in the long run. It keeps us trapped in the past and prevents us from experiencing the joy and peace that God wants for us. Forgiveness does not mean excusing the betrayal or pretending it didn't happen. It means releasing the burden of revenge and trusting God to bring justice in His time. It means allowing His love to restore what was broken. Joseph's life also teaches us the power of trusting God through betrayal. His own brothers sold him into slavery, and he spent years suffering because of their actions. Yet, instead of growing bitter, he remained faithful to God. When he finally confronted his brothers, he could have sought revenge, but instead he said, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." Genesis 50:20-11. Joseph recognized that God had a greater plan, even in his suffering. If you have been betrayed, it is understandable to feel hurt. But do not let that pain control your future. Trust that God is working, even when you cannot see it. He promises to bring beauty from ashes, to heal the brokenhearted, and to restore what was lost. Psalm 147:3 says, He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. God does not waste your pain. He uses it to make you stronger, to draw you closer to Him, and to prepare you for something greater. Instead of focusing on the betrayal, focus on God's faithfulness. He has never abandoned you, and He never will. Trust Him to guide you through the pain, to bring healing to your heart, and to lead you to a future filled with hope. Betrayal may be a part of your story, but it does not have to be the end of it. With God's help, you can move forward, free from bitterness, and walk in the peace and victory that He has prepared for you. When betrayal strikes, it can leave deep wounds that seem impossible to heal. The pain of being deceived, rejected, or abandoned by someone you trusted can linger, making it difficult to move forward. You may feel like the betrayal has left a permanent mark on your heart, that things will never be the same again. However, no matter how painful the betrayal, God has the power to heal and restore you completely. He does not want you to remain trapped in bitterness, sorrow, or regret. His desire is to bring healing to your soul and lead you into a life of peace, wholeness, and renewed strength. God's healing is not just about forgetting the betrayal. It is about transforming the pain into something that no longer controls you. Psalm 147:3 says, He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. This is a promise that God is not only aware of your suffering, but is actively working to restore you. He sees the hurt that others may not see, the silent tears, the questions that fill your mind at night. And He does not leave you to heal on your own. His love reaches into the deepest parts of your heart, bringing comfort where there was sorrow and peace where there was turmoil. Healing from betrayal is a process, and it often begins with surrender. Many times when we are hurt, we want to hold on to the pain, replaying the betrayal over and over in our minds. We want answers, explanations, or even justice on our terms. But true healing comes when we lay our burdens before God and trust Him to handle what we cannot. In Matthew 11:28, Jesus invites us to do just that. Come to me, all you are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. The weight of betrayal is too heavy to carry alone. But God is ready to lift that burden off your shoulders if you will let Him. One of the biggest obstacles to healing is unforgiveness. Holding on to resentment can keep you trapped in the past, preventing you from experiencing the full restoration that God wants to give you. Forgiveness does not mean excusing the betrayal or pretending it did not hurt. It means releasing the offense into God's hands and allowing Him to bring justice in His perfect time. When Joseph was betrayed by his brothers and sold into slavery, he had every reason to hold on to bitterness. Yet, years later, when he was in a position of power and faced his brothers again, he chose forgiveness. He saw how God had used his pain for a greater purpose and declared, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." Joseph's healing allowed him to move forward and step into the destiny God had planned for him. Another key to healing is allowing God to renew your heart and mind. Betrayal can leave you feeling broken and unworthy of love or trust. It can cause you to build walls around your heart, afraid to trust again. But God wants to restore your confidence and remind you of your true worth. You are not defined by what was done to you. You are defined by who God says you are. He calls you His beloved, His child, and He has a future for you that is filled with hope. Romans 8:28 assures us, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose." Even when betrayal shakes your world, God is still working, still guiding, still restoring. Healing does not mean you will never remember the betrayal, but it does mean that it will no longer have power over you. Instead of living in pain, you can live in peace. Instead of being controlled by the past, you can walk boldly into the future. God's love is greater than any wound, His grace is deeper than any pain, and His restoration is more powerful than any betrayal. No matter how broken you feel today, trust that He is able to make you whole again. Let him heal you, let him restore you, and step forward with faith, knowing that your best days are still ahead.